Some of the gas chambers used in Operation T4 that had been temporarily shut down were reactivated. In the concentration camps in Germany, psychiatrists and SS physicians now began selecting prisoners to be sent to death. The name of this new operation was 14F13. You, Dr. Hallervorden, continue to receive your brains. In a report dating from 1942 and addressed to the German Research Foundation, you wrote, "I am continuing my research on congenital idiocy. We removed and prepared 500 brains from feeble-minded individuals, in addition to the ample material that comes from the pathology laboratory in Göden. In order to properly examine everything, we would need to hire more personnel, but that won't be possible until the war is over." In March 1944, you mentioned the following: "I have received 697 brains in all, including those which I myself removed one day at Brandenburg." From 1942 to 1945, the Nazi extermination machine was operating at full capacity. Huge numbers of Jews and Gypsies were being gassed in the extermination centers in Poland. Prisoners in Germany were gassed in the facilities formerly used for Operation T4 and even in certain German concentration camps. And the disabled continued to be poisoned or starved to death in all of the psychiatric hospitals in Germany. During the war, you received a total of 5,174 brains. 1,500 brains were furnished by the Wehrmacht, including 185 from Jewish hospitals in Warsaw and Lublin. 2,227 brains were of unknown origin. 1,447 came from different hospitals in the Berlin area, and among them at least 697 came from patients who were killed. On May 8, 1945, the German army surrendered. The war had come to an end. It was only at this point that the killings in psychiatric institutions stopped. In a safe in the Hartheim gassing facility, the War Crimes Investigation Team, led by the American Army, found a pamphlet written in 1941 at the end of the T4 program entitled "The Work Accomplished by the Operation to Date." It contained estimates of how much money the T4 program would save for the next 10 years. It took into account the flour, the bread, the dairy products, the vegetables, and even the salt that the people eliminated would not consume. According to these calculations, by 1951, the Reich would have saved up to 885,439,800 Reichmarks. The meticulous author of this document also entered the precise number of victims that were gassed center by center. Grafeneck, 9,839. Brandenburg, 9,772. Bernburg, 8,601. Hartheim, 18,269. Pirna Sonnenstein, 13,720. Hadamar, 10,072. Which adds up to a total of 70,273 victims. There is, however, no document that shows the number of people killed in psychiatric hospitals during the whole period, from the beginning to the end of the war. You, Dr. Hallervorden, were now living in a small town north of Frankfurt. You received a visit from a neuropsychiatrist named Leo Alexander, an Austrian Jew, who had emigrated to the United States in 1933. You proudly showed him your activity reports, your collection, and 5 unpublished scientific papers. When Leo Alexander came to your house on that day in June 1945, were you aware that he was investigating the medical crimes of the Nazi regime and would subsequently present his findings at the Nuremberg trials? According to his report, you considered the killings to be illegal. You told Leo Alexander, a fellow neurologist, that you felt pity for those children, and that whenever a new batch of brains arrived, it made you feel a little queasy. You also said that psychiatrists had discredited themselves as a result of the whole affair, but you concluded, still, there were interesting cases in this material. At the first Nuremberg trial brought against the leaders of the Nazi regime, one of the prosecutors read out excerpts from Leo Alexander's report. Your name was cited. The newspapers immediately published the information, but they made a mistake. They said you had removed the brains at the Mauthausen concentration camp. Suddenly you were in the spotlight. You frantically wrote dozens of letters to clear your name, explaining that you had never been to Mauthausen. You took advantage of this mistake to revise what you said to Alexander. Although, yes, you had received the brains, you yourself had never requested them. You insisted on being heard at the Nuremberg trial. Your request was denied. The doctor's trial began in December 1946. Among the 23 defendants, there were 2 T4 officials, Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and Victor Brack, the operations supervisor. You were not investigated.
Military Tribunal 1 sentences you, Karl Brandt, to death by hanging, and may God have mercy upon your soul. The officer of the guard was removed to defendant Brandt.
Victor Brack was also sentenced to death by hanging. Dr. Eberl, who had been the director of the Brandenburg facility at Bernburg and then at the Treblinka extermination camp, hung himself in prison in 1948. His assistants, Dr. Bunke and Dr. Ulrich, pursued their medical careers. It wasn't until 1988 that they were sentenced to 3 years in prison for the murder of 9,200 people. They were released a little over a year later. Your friend Dr. Heinze was sentenced to 7 years in prison by a Soviet court in 1946. In 1953, he was once again the director of a psychiatric clinic. You, Dr. Hallervorden, were seen as nothing more than a sympathizer, and you continued your career without interruption. You became a professor of pathology at the Max Planck Institute, which had replaced the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Your collection of brains followed you from one laboratory to the next. You even published an article in 1948 in the journal The Neurologist, which examined the case of a child called Werner. You did not mention the fact that the child had been a victim of the T4 program. In 1953, you were supposed to speak at the International Congress of Neurology in Lisbon. You were known for the unique collection of brains you had acquired. But the information contained in the Alexander report resurfaced and created a heated debate in the scientific community. The controversy grew to such a point that you were unable to speak at the conference. You would never again refer to your role in Operation T4. You continued your long career and were distinguished with many honors. You would even be awarded the prestigious Cross of Honor of the Federal Republic of Germany. Did you ever examine your conscience? You died in 1965 at the age of 83. But your story does not end there. This little datebook was discovered in 1940. It would finally bring to light the exact nature of your involvement in the program to exterminate disabled patients. It belonged to Dr. Eberl, who was the director of the gassing facility in Brandenburg. Eberl is laconic. Under each day is written the name of a psychiatric hospital, followed by an F for the days when women were gassed, an M for men, a J for Jews, and a K for children. Your name, Hallervorden, is mentioned 3 times. First, in early October, you had an appointment with the doctors Bunke and Eberl at the psychiatric hospital in Gurden. It appears a second time the following week next to your telephone number. And finally, on October 28, 1940, it says, "Pick up Hallervorden," with Gurden next to your name, and a K for children. When you met with Dr. Bunke and Dr. Eberl at the Gurden Psychiatric Hospital, we do not know whether you were there to make a selection of children, those with interesting pathologies. However, we do know that on Monday, October 28, 1940, Dr. Eberl came to pick you up at the train station. He drove you to the extermination center in Brandenburg. You waited with him for the arrival of 59 children. You were there when they were gassed, and immediately afterwards, you removed the brains of 40 of them, brains that were connected with your research project entitled Hereditary Mental Deficiency.
We can assume that Hallervorden, just after the children were gassed, removed the brains, presumably with his assistants, and prepared them so as to preserve them, and then took them back to Berlin in order to study them. So Dr. Hallervorden can clearly be seen as someone who knew about the gassing, who helped plan it, and as a result, we can assume that he approved of it. A case such as this could be seen as a specially commissioned death order. The children were brought in on the basis of their interest for neuropathological research and then killed for the benefit of the pathology department at the Institute for Brain Research.
In 1990, in a cemetery in Munich, a ceremony was held for the burial of all the brains and specimens in your collection. Due to the revelations about your past, the disease you discovered no longer bears your name. In 2000, in the very place where you conducted your research at Berlin-Buch, a memorial was inaugurated for the victims of Operation T4. No numbers and no names were mentioned. Your thirst for knowledge and recognition made you deaf and blind to humanity. How could your interest in science obliterate your medical conscience to such a point as to see other people as nothing but research material? You made compromise after compromise until you ended up selecting the children to be killed. You became a murderer. That has nothing to do with science.